All right, everybody. Welcome back for another episode of Riftbound 101. Apologies for coming to you with this one a bit late. Work has been crazy recently, and I figured I was going to do a bigger episode for the move from Origins to Spirit Forged, kind of wholesale. And I got bogged down increasingly trying to write an episode about things that matter to the game right now, a lot of balance issue stuff, and I kept coming back to this idea of what is a meta. And for folks who've been following the channel for a little bit, I made an episode, episode 8, which was called, How to Navigate a Meta. And I think this is a spiritual sequel to that episode, but if you haven't watched it, you don't need to. This episode is really going to be about really the high order concepts around what a metagame is. This is kind of a soft reply to a comment I got on that video that has sat with me for a while. So that's going to be the plan for today. And fair warning, this is going to be probably the closest episodes we'll get to what it looks like when I lecture in class. So if you've ever wondered what a game studies class looks like in a university context, this is going to be somewhat closer to that, but not fully matching the tone and the kind of examples that I have access to. No video clips in this one. So the plan for today is really going to be to talk about theoretical origins for what metagames are and the sort of long history of those. And then I'm going to talk a bit about how they're applied to Spirit Forged, among other things, but in general, I think we can think about their application. And then I want to talk about materiality, so some of the material constraints to how metas evolve and how you probably engage with them. Questions of taste, and finally, questions of player agency. So, what your role is in this. And I feel like this is going to simultaneously be more than maybe I do in other episodes, but less than I would like to do if I had like a full 2 to 3 hours of your time to actually do activities and workshops and talk with you all about this. So, yeah, let's get started. I'm going to cut off the discussion of metagames really starting in the 20th century. The much older tradition in Greek is to talk about the etymological origin of the term meta and also to sort of move beyond it. But I think for the purpose of having a constrained discussion today, I'm going to start more recently. And the comment that I was mentioning earlier was somebody who commented on that video saying, well, why are you doing a video? The meta really just means most efficient tactics available. And I I begrudgingly tip my hat to that person because I don't think it's entirely incorrect. But like the Connor McNeil article about FGC metas from about 4 or 5 years ago presents, that's not what we really mean when we're talking about a meta exclusively. Yes, most efficient tactics available are a part of the meta, but they're not the only part. And strictly speaking, it is a backronym, right? It's something that was overlaid onto what the actual term means and happens to sort of work very well within that framework, but not necessarily what I would lead with in terms of defining what a meta is. If we go back much further, and really, I'm going to be talking about this historical lineage starting in 1944 through Stephanie Boluk and Patrick Lemieux's metagaming book, which if you get a chance to pick this up and read through it, I would recommend it highly. It's got, a theoretical introduction about metagames and their history, and then it's about 6 case studies that are all definitions of different metagames. I think this book, although I have critiques about it, is maybe the most lucrative investment of time if you want to think about metagames and really their application to a range of different games and historical contexts. Games like Eve, games like Magic, games like World of Warcraft. So a ton of stuff. But they highlight how one of the first modern formulations of metagames really comes from John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern's Theory of Games and Economic Behavior from 1944, which is really about the study of mathematical models of conflict and cooperation between intelligent, rational decision makers. And the context for this is really the end of the Second World War and the start of the Cold War and nuclear deterrence, calculus, and foreign policy. So if you're thinking about one of the first metagames, the book really is concerned with something like um, basically like mutually assured destruction, MAD, and the idea that if somebody presses the nuclear button, then other people would. And so what are like the maneuvers and the sort of disclosures that you can effect to have that not happen, right? And so really the first instantiation of metagame is in more math oriented game theory uh, approaches to the subject. And that quickly changes, right? By 1971, we have Nigel Howard's Paradoxes of Rationality, where we're no longer talking about mathematical models, we're talking about non quantitative, non rational forms of metagaming, which is really about alterations to your strategy in knowledge of somebody else's choices, right? So it is now about reactive thinking that is not necessarily based on, uh, you know, predictable outcomes. It is based on knowledge of who the people around you are and what matters to them. And this is really approaching not necessarily just nuclear deterrence calculus, but the prisoner's dilemma. And the most, I think, straightforward one that we have these days is William Poundstone's 1993 definition, which is really about sort of a fictional contemporary thought exercise where two members of a criminal gang are arrested, and basically there's not enough evidence to convict both of them. So it is about asking both criminals to disclose or confess to the crime under the idea that they would be spared punishment and the partner would be punished. And this creates, I think, a ton of interesting like game decision math to discuss. Good example, there's been a lot of writing about the prisoner's dilemma and the cardristic study in Magic, especially in Commander 4-player formats, right? So it's more about what motivates people, what decisions are they likely to make, and you are playing not the situation that is in front of you, but actually the situation that's in front of you in the context of other decisions made by other actors. And I think this sort of starts to shift much more directly into discussions of games, with Richard Garfield talking about wargaming and his sort of perspectives on this. Richard Garfield, first designer of Magic the Gathering, and later co-designer for Keyforge. And Garfield has really sort of set up 4 qualities for what happens in a metagame that I talked about in the other video. So what do players bring? What do players take away? What happens between games? And what happens in a game that's not part of the game? But I think his more radical formulation that is going to be interesting for us today is how a game interfaces with life, or with, the game beyond itself. And if this was a game studies class, I would probably be teaching this on like week 4 and 5 after talking to you about the magic circle, which is another concept that you should probably check out, although a complicated concept in itself. And Garfield has written a lot about role-playing in D&D, which is where the first quote comes from, and also talked about at GDC about his concept of metagames. So this is like the first, games relevant version of this that we encounter. And then a couple years, not too long ago, Marcus Carter et al. Talked about sort of the breakdown between metagame nomenclature. So the idea that it's now used so widely that it's actually become impossible to really apply it equally to all forms of metagame discussion. But what they really qualify as a metagame is the consideration of external resources when it involves awareness of the context of play. So it's about understanding the parameters of play and then using other resources that are external to it. And this was at Foundations for Digital Games. I think the conference that they were at was in New York, but I had the pleasure to speak at this conference back in 2022 in Athens. So I have a big soft spot in my heart for this conference. And then we get Bullock and Lemieux's book, right? And sort of the accumulation of all of these texts and all of this information is sort of a much broader, open-ended understanding of metagames, not as one specific metagame or relevant to a specific game, but really the development of the history of play and how we think about play and how we think about playing games and especially like everything that factors into it. So you can understand why I might be slightly annoyed when somebody tells me a meta is simply the most efficient tactics available, because I think there's a lot more that factors into it, even though that is a part of it. So this is all very theoretical, and that's nice, but you kind of want to talk about the application of metagame concepts and the formation of a metagame, right? So if you take a look at how the metagame has been shaping up with Spirit Forged, you can notice that the metagame sort of takes shape in a relative vacuum at first, right? So people are doing card predictions. They're trying to figure out the average power of a card in a vacuum, applying it to information that already exists, but it is relatively divorced from physical play or digital play for that matter. And then it starts to be deployed in the world and it kind of settles, right? A lot of that theoretical information feels very concrete, feels very reliable quickly, but metagames are actually constantly changing and malleable. And they also developed unevenly, right? The Chinese metagame develops months before the rest of the world, in Riftbound especially. And then it shifts. And we should talk about those shifts a little bit. So back when Spirit Forge was being revealed, I was asked, you should do a tier list. What are the champions that you think are top tier or are going to be at the top of the meta? And I think I never made one of those videos because I had trouble really settling on the parameters of what I would want a tier list to look like. And especially, the fact that it shifts, I would have produced something that looked a lot like this. And this is not a perfect tier list. This is really just a thought exercise to think through how probably I would have defined it and where I would have placed champions and talked about relative matchups and card power in a vacuum, and the fact that red and purple still have the best array of removal spells and card advantage and accelerated units and all of that. And I think this would have borne out relatively well with tournament results, although Irelia may have been put down at the top of A, and MF is a bit absent, but I think is still one of the top meta contenders and the best home for Aurora probably. And then, we could have had some fringe discussions about like the placement of Rek'Sai or Lucian, or people who are, going to tell me that they're really in on Ornn and I just haven't found the right build, and that actually he's like A tier. These are all discussions that are incredibly fixed to the power card, the power of the cards in a vacuum. And if you look at something like the Rift deck popularity meter, you're going to see something that like pretty much quantifies this kind of approach to making tier lists or meta lists. So you could say, well, okay, look at how popular purple Chaos Runes are. It must be the best color, and Fury as well. And then Fight or Flight is the best spell because obviously it's included at 2.5 to some plus minus percentage in the decks that can run it. And then basically it's like 5 purple spells in Kaisa. And then you could say, well, clearly purple is the top tier color. And then it's a combination of red or blue. And that's, we figure it out. It's fixed. But then you look at something like how the popularity is calculated, right? So the popularity on Rift decks for these cards is calculated in the total number of inclusions over the past 30 days, 30 decks, divided by 30 to get like an average count. And then the top card is really used as a 100% popularity benchmark. So in actuality, this doesn't mean that like 100% of decks use Chaos Runes. It just means that Chaos Runes are the most popular and all other measures are relative to those. That doesn't mean that other colors are incapable or are less interesting or are in fact less played. It means that these are the most popular, but everything is a relative measure. And these shift over time, right? If these are calculated dynamically, by the time we get to the US, people are getting a sheet and they're saying, okay, well, I have all this information, but maybe it's going to change. Lo and behold, in the first week of CN Regionals, we had 40 Draven and 8 Aurelias at the top. People were doom and glooming. I'm going to be honest. I was also, pretty cold on this. And especially I was cold on the fact that 51 decks out of 64 were chaos-based decks. And then, another 45, 46, 47 of those were Fury. So I was like, okay, so, play purple, play orange, play red, and you're going to be good, and basically nothing else. And that would have been it, right? We did it, we dusted it. Draven's good. We did it, we calculated in a vacuum, and now we know how the meta is going to shape up forever. This would have been, the most efficient tactics available sort of metric. We figured out that Draven has the best spells, the best units, the best strategy, the best card advantage, and now maybe there's going to be a deck that can like squeeze some wins from him, but very clearly he is at the center of the meta forever. Unfortunately, or fortunately for us, there were 3 more tournaments, and I'm recording this, a couple days after Nanjing, so depending on when you're watching this is like February 11th for me. You're going to see that there were in fact 4 regionals, and we're not super far off from Bologna either, and Vegas in the West. So this is going to keep shifting. And what happened week 2, Draven went down, and Aurelia went up, and Kaisa also went down. So there's sort of like a spread out to other legends. Is it a question of Draven getting weaker? Go next week. 27 Dravens, 14 Aurelias, 6 Kaisas. Kaisa wins, feeling like, okay, so maybe Kaisa is actually a good deck, and now you have all these other one-ofs that are at the top. And then last week, 22 Draven, 12 Kaisas post-win, 10 Aurelias, 3 Annies, Annie wins. So now we're getting into a question of, okay, well, is Draven just like not as strong as people thought, or what's happening here? And there's a couple of ways to approach this problem. So one sort of approach to it has been to say, well, the meta's adjusting. It's doing what it's supposed to, what I was talking about in the Fair, Fun, and Bans video. Players are finding new answers. The known decks are becoming vulnerable because people understand how to play against them. And then decks are refined overall, right? We're getting into better versions of shit decks, and the top deck has been tested so much that it's hard to optimize it anymore. So basically, like, most Draven lists just look the same. But there is something else at work here. Materiality. And I feel like this is the most important part of the puzzle to understanding a little bit what's happening with changes in the meta. So if you take, for example, the Houston regional that happened back in November, Diwali, who won with Annie, posted, just a couple days later, I guess actually it was early December, that he was selling his Metal Annie and the cards from the tournament. And I'm pretty sure Metal Annie sold for something like 20 grand US, but don't quote me on the value. A lot of money, right? There were jokes that Diwali was going to pay, put a down payment on a house. And at the time, in the Chinese meta and regionals, there were not metal cards. Now there are. So metal cards often are competing with the tournament regional qualifier sort of bracket. So if you make it to day 2, you get top 64. My understanding is that you are then invited to nationals. And so everybody who was on week 1 Draven, because it was the, meta pick, it was the assumed best deck, all of a sudden, if they qualified, now they're not requalifying if they're showing up for other tournaments. They are playing for metal cards. And the metal cards are repeatable, but if you're playing and you're, the best Lucian in top 64, and there are like 37 Dravens, the 37 Dravens have to play against a field of X2 or better players to get access to that prizing, whereas the Lucian player has already won. And he can play for additional tournament prizing, but really his run is complete at that point, or whichever hero they're picking. And so there's a financial layer, and this is what I mean by materiality, right? Like, these cards have a value, they exist in an economic system, and people are selling and buying these, as is the case for most of the alternate art cards or even the rare picks. If you take a look at decks that aren't placing so well, you can notice that the value to build those decks is a lot lower. So decks like Ari that are placing like 100th, costing like $90, whereas like Draven decks are pushing like $500 or more at this point. So it's not just that the pricing is much better in certain cases, but the cost to field these decks is also a lot lower, or was a lot lower before certain of these showed success. So there's like double pressure, right? There's economic pressure or material pressure to fight for the goal for the metal cards for champions, and there's also pressure on the budgetary side to just buy decks that people aren't playing and become very good with them. So when you look at something like, for example, Fiora, and the fact that Fiora was in 2 top 4s, it becomes really hard to figure out if the meta is adjusting and its counter strategy to Draven. I would argue that the hook version certainly is aimed at denying Draven value, or it may be people who are, already qualified and are now looking to make more money. So as is the case for much of these observations and analysis, correlation does not equal causation. I can't tell you if it is one or the other. It's kind of impossible to know. And I think that's really the point of this, is you can't really make a claim about meta and most efficient tactics available when your motivations and reasoning are already quite muddled. But it gets more complicated. So if you take a look at the upcoming regional qualifiers, we also have to take into account that we are already like in a meta that is kickstarted, and we are going to get Bologna, Las Vegas, Lille, and Atlanta, and I think those are going to be the Spirit Force tournaments, and these are going to cross continental boundaries, and then we're going to swap sets, right? So there's going to be constant up and down pressure on prices, and also the prices to get to these tournaments that is going to affect a lot of the demand. A good example of this is Bologna is basically a week from now, and a lot of players are going to be looking for cards for Draven and other tournament decks, which is going to drive prices up. So people are going to look up these cards and going to say, wow, they're so expensive, they must be for meta decks. But there is sort of a specific pressure here, which is also the tournament scene to keep in context. And then this is going to rotate through different markets and through different sets. So everything is going to like exert pressure from different angles over what seems to be the most in demand card, or what are like expensive cards, which is somewhat related to the perception of their tournament placing track record, but also really difficult to figure out in terms of what is necessary for each player at each time. Let's put it that way. This, if I was in a class, and I'm kind of in a class right now, I would talk to you about base and superstructure and like Marxian economics, which I would tell you a lot of the perception of how good these decks are is actually being determined by the capacity of these decks to compete for money at various times and in various ways, and also their cost. So there's a lot of sequential like modification of prices and perception of these, which is part of a different kind of meta. It is the game beyond the game that is orienting a lot of these prices. Now, if only tournament perception and pricing and performance was correct, prices would look somewhat different. Take a look at Spinning Axe, currently going for 75 US, and really what we've seen so far is 126 Dravens in the top 64s across all the Chinese tournaments. And then you look at something like Arise, which is essential for Azir, and you're going to see that there's been 4 Azirs in all top 64s. Obviously, if I had the exact metrics, it would be different. We would be looking also at the open field, amount of representation for these decks. But realistically, it's hard to imagine that Arise should be half the price of Spinning Axe when Spinning Axe is roughly like 30 times more in demand, or 31 times more in demand at high levels than Arises. And maybe demand is incorrect. It is represented at that level, and that representation belies conversion percentages that are very good. So it would be like the open field demand versus the perception of how well these decks convert into top 64. All this said, something is out of whack, because if we were only talking about material value, Arise should probably be like a $5 card, or like a $10 card or something. So something's wacky Let's put it that way. And this is where I would argue that beyond even just thinking about the meta as like an efficiency metric, I would even say it's incorrect to look at the meta only through the lens of the metal cards and the economic vectors, which become insufficient to figure out consumer shifts in demand and everything else. This is, of course, holding all factors equal, so like equal access to product. There's as many spinning axes getting open as arises, which might not be the case. There are some like extenuating factors. I would posit that a big reason for this is taste. And taste is incredibly hard to discuss in, a quantitative manner. This is a massive headache for people who are doing quantitative research. I do qualitative and much more like artistic formal analysis, so I'm in my bag and I'm about to, explode your mind, perhaps. So Pierre Bourdieu, French sociologist extraordinaire, who is sort of at the root of a lot of my work and a lot of the work of other cultural scholars, has this book called Distinction, which is part of many of his amazing works, where he talks about sort of what motivates people towards making certain decisions, dressing a certain way, consuming certain goods. And I would draw your attention to the Azir Mains subreddit. So this is a subreddit community, and there are ones for basically every hero in League of Legends, for each champion. And this subreddit has been active since 2014, so 11 years at this point, of people who are overtly identifying and going to a community specifically for Azir mains. And I don't play League, or haven't in many, many years, so I'm not there. But this indicates to me something a bit different, right? Beyond ideas of competitive placement and pricing, there are people who are just Azir mains. So Bourdieu's approach to this would be to think of taste as sort of a classification system for what's good and what's bad in a broader system of conditioning, right? So we would think of Azir relative to other champions in a complicated system. And also, like, aesthetically and in terms of gameplay mechanics, we would have certain feelings about that. Those would also be couched in another discussion that would be like up on the scale. That would be like the same kind of question about League of Legends in general, and then video games in general, and then media in general. And we would just keep having these discussions about like what's important, what matters. So the people who identify as Azir mains and are probably like buying a lot of Arises currently are doing this because it is a cultural marker for them. They belong to a community. They are enjoying certain kinds of aesthetic cues. And this also might be relevant to playstyle, right? So they might like the playstyle of this deck. That often also will favor into this. What I show my students whenever I'm teaching a pop culture class is the LeBron James Louis Vuitton ad. And I ask them, who's winning here, right? What is the order of operations here? Is LeBron James winning because he now has a Louis Vuitton ad, and that's a cultural marker of, excellence and high fashion? Or is the Louis Vuitton brand winning because now they have LeBron on their ads, which brings in a lot of younger, maybe sports-oriented consumers who would never have picked up a Louis Vuitton product before? The answer is kind of both, and this ad is a marriage of both, but I would argue that the biggest winner is the Louis Vuitton brand, right? And so if you think of certain cultural markers being attached to a game, and you think of something like Azir doesn't just house Azir. Azir houses a lot of other kind of media representations of things like ancient Egypt, gold, gods, birds, whatever you want to look at. So I think of these in terms of what's called symbolic imposition, right? So whenever you have a cultural product, it's kind of constituted in an array of different media types and different media representations. So it becomes the finished product only at the end of this. This is true for the card game that we are currently talking about, but it's also true for media portrayals in general. If you look at, for example, the Aurelia Lunar New Year bundle, this is a product that is based on the expected, warmth of reception towards Aurelia in China in general, which is based on a series of cultural markers and connotations that are, making this a really uh, interesting product to the people who are living there or who are playing in this context. If you look at something else that is, I think, a bit more gross, you can look at the usage of Pokemon cards as jewelry by, oh my god, I think it's Logan Paul, but I can never remember which Paul is which, and I honestly don't care that much. There's sort of an acknowledgement that these cultural symbols can become like bearers of economic value by virtue of their popularity or nostalgia or things that matter to people. So Charizard is popular not because he's wearing it. He is getting something from wearing a Charizard that a lot of people have feelings about, which is based in partially how strong the unit was in the game, partially nostalgia around Pokemon, and partially memories about the card game itself. And so when I looked at Azir back in 2021 in Legends of Runeterra, I was like, this is sick. I want to be an Azir main. He has a lot of things that I like in other media, and I like the playstyle, so it's a bit of both. And this is a choice that I made, not as an Azir main of League, but I guess as an Azir main of Legends of Runeterra, that goes much deeper, right? I grew up watching Mummies Alive and The Mummy, which is like the quintessential millennial, text for a lot of people. And I wrote my dissertation about Assassin's Creed Origins, and I played it like 3 times for the project and before. So I consume a lot of media that has like Egyptian culture in it, and I like the motifs. It looks good to me. I don't know. I get like a good feeling about it. It's a taste that I developed and that has been developed around me. And this is in part because a lot of this media draws on archaeology and the anthropological tradition of archaeological findings from going as far back as the 1700s, but really the late 1800s and 1900s in French and British culture. So a lot of this stuff has long tails, right? You're not just interfacing with the game itself, you're interfacing with like a whole canon of things that you like. And that might be the case for a lot of you. You might have feelings about Shen because you grew up watching Ninja Media, or if you love pirates, maybe you like MF and Gangplank. And these are things that matter, right? So the taste that you have about these cards and the system of taste isn't just based on their economic value. It's based on a ton of different systems of goods that are sort of circulating around this and are making it look good. Simultaneously, as much as I like Azir, I have a lot of trouble with cards like Seraphine, because Seraphine to me indicates a completely different ecosystem of taste that is not to my liking. It's not what I grew up with, and it does nothing for me. It might actually be abrasive to me. And I take that as an example, but I could have the same kind of discussion about KDA, or I don't know, like Kiana, or I don't know, like a variety of different cards. And I would imagine if you reflect on the cards that you like and the archetypes that you like, you might notice this too. This is also a very good indicator, by the way, why when all of the overnumbered cards for Origins were spiking or tanking in price, playability really helped Kaisa, but Ari was never tournament, like super tournament viable, and yet remained one of the most, like held the value the most outside of the Kaisa overnumber, which was the, top dog. And so like the Ari overnumbers are still worth a ton, and the Ari overnumber for the new set, if I'm not mistaken, is also like very, very expensive, despite the fact that Ari is kind of a C to D tier hero in terms of like tournament placement. So I get to this to say like the meta is not really about efficient tactics. Or if it is, it's really one concern that is dominating at a specific point in the development cycle of the metagame that you are currently playing. There are many other factors that are influencing this. And I think of that meme of like the the Arthurian knights around the table. Many people are coming to this game with different motivations. Tournament grinders are ones for sure, but I don't run into them that much. And even when I go to skirmishes, I run into a lot of different decks. The last skirmish I did, I ran into like half the field being Yasuo, which is completely not in line with larger tournaments. And I run into experimenters, socializers, people with main champions, casual players, and collectors who are only opening for the value of the product or because they think the cards are beautiful. All of these people are playing and they're producing a meta. And that meta is partially determined by efficiency, but it's also determined by a ton of other factors. So I get to this because I think a lot of people are like scared or frustrated that Draven is currently dominating, and we're gonna see some changes to the meta for sure. I'm not saying he won't be the best deck in the next couple of months. Very likely he will be, but that doesn't mean that you will see Dravens constantly at your table, especially the first couple of weeks when people do not have access to that much card product. So the question I pose to you as players, and that I pose to myself really, is why do you play, how do you play, and how much do you play? And I think if you can answer these three questions, you're going to find your space in the metagame, and you're going to find the cards that you want to be playing, rather than what some tier list tells you is the best deck in a vacuum or competitively. Now, these questions really are determined by your regional and national level, and then they're determined by the material resources of the culture that is around you, right? You are an active participant in this. And this is also why there are material differences between metagames in different continents, right? Like CN and NA or EU Riftbound look different, but that's also the case for a ton of other games. And this also has to do with like the history that the game has been out in both locales, and also the fact that like for many NA players, they've been playing Magic since the late 90s. I've been playing since about 1997. But there are people who started playing in the EU also in 94 when The Dark released in Italy. So games are old in the West, card games in particular. And not everybody is getting to these with the same level of literacy and practice, but also not the same tastes. And the meme that I like to talk about this is people treat the meta like traffic, right? You can always hear people say like, I'm stuck in traffic. Why am I stuck in traffic? And the joke is always like, you're not stuck in traffic, you are the traffic. But I would go a step further, right? And say, if we all know that materially speaking, the best car is a Ferrari or a Lamborghini because it goes the fastest and you can get from point A to point B the best, why the hell are we all not driving that? And the answers are myriad. People have different needs. People have different budgets. The infrastructure is not set up for them properly. And there are just aesthetic preferences. So, hell, I drove a smart car for like a decade in Canadian winter, which is an insane thing in itself. But all this to say, right, the meta is not something that happens to you. It's something that you are an active participant in. And so to the question, why do you play? There are a couple of answers. And you might say, if it's to win tournaments, I would say, well, play what performs well in tournaments. And what performs well in tournaments is going to be determined by dominant decks and sort of strategies that prey upon that. If you're playing for metal cards, then you want to play what you're confident with. And if it's just because you love a legend or because, like me, you are an Azir main, then just play Azir. Play what you like. If the answer to how do you play is more important for you, you might, talk about skill expression, in which case choose decks that have a lot of skill expression with micro decisions. If it's to find your own style, then just experiment with a ton of decks until you find something that you like. And if you just want to gain edge on popular decks, then test with better players than you. I lose a lot when I go to events, and I try to make links with those players because if they beat me, I have things to learn from them. I'm not angry that they beat me with Draven. I want to understand why they play Draven, and maybe it'll change the way that I play. And if you like limited and you don't like to deal with any of this, then just buy a box with your friends and draft. And this, of course, implies that you can access a box, which is another discussion in itself. But this is a different orientation to the game. And then finally, how much do you play? I would always argue that you should match your budget to your commitment level. If this is a game that you're sort of trying to figure out if you like, then buy in low and scale up. Get commons, get starter decks. If you want to compete, then probably get good decks or get cheap decks that are performing well into the field. And if you are somebody who wants to collect, then get the special editions, regardless of what the meta is. These are very short answers that I'm giving you to complicated questions, but I think asking those questions and understanding how you are interacting with the meta, which is not a field of efficient tactics. It is the sum total of every game around this game, which is how you play with other people, where you go, what kind of tournaments you go to, what kind of decks you like, what other things do you like that is influencing this your participation in this game is going to get you a lot further. So the last thing that I would say really is thinking back to Garfield's comment from the 2000 GDC talk. The meta that you are participating in influences and interfaces with all the cultural and economic aspects of your life around this game, around other games that you play, around media that you consume. And you can just keep zooming out and understanding why it is that you enjoy this game, or why it is that you're frustrated with it, and why the changes in the meta really annoys you, right? You're going to be able to locate either avenues to deal better with the game, or to get incremental gains, or to disconnect from it and to play something else. And this isn't me saying like, if Draven's meta too bad, like deal with it. It is a question to say, to what extent does it matter to you that Draven is the best deck versus somebody who is like competing at regionals? So the question of what the meta is and what you're dealing with, how you live through it, I think is quite broad and amorphous, and moves from game theory, which is what I imagine a lot of people think when they think about game metas, into something that is much more about your cultural lived world. And I think a lot about Stemkowski's quote about metagames, which was about StarCraft, which is, every game with a metagame worth understanding deserves a devoted historian. And that's likely because every metagame is really like a cultural moment and a scene and an entire historical process coming to bear. So Riftbound is young, but it will be the case that it is drawing a lot of older stuff. And in time, if the game survives, it'll also become older. So it'll, have its own history to study, hopefully. Yeah. This has been a big yap session about what a meta is and why I hate and also respect begrudgingly the acronym most efficient tactics available. But hopefully this has been useful for you. And I hope that it's also going to stay with you as we move into different sets throughout this game. Hopefully not all Draven dominated. Otherwise, that's it for today. And what you can expect, the plan for Friday is to do a double feature for Annie and MF, who are the last two champions I have to cover for Origins. And then we will be done and moving into other discussions about champions that are in Spiritforged, competitive events that are coming up. And soon, you might have noticed that I'm sort of starting to veer into discussing a little bit discussions about flavor design and cultural design in the game, which is really like my primary bag. Let's put it that way. Otherwise, thank you for tuning in, and hopefully this was enjoyable to you. I will see you next week, or actually end of the week.